Hello, my name is Norman Weinberg, and I thank you for watching this virtual clinic at PASIC 2021 titled Developing Subtlety and Nuance for Percussionists. I would like to thank the Percussive Arts Society for inviting me to present this virtual clinic, and I offer a huge thank you to the percussion manufacturers who have given me their support over my playing and teaching career: Yamaha, Zildjian, Vic Firth, Remo, and Black Swamp. And I would like to also thank three of my former students: Mike Sammons, Director of Percussion at the University of Utah; Rick Puzo, Director of Percussion at Chadron State College; and Trevor Barrero, currently a DMA candidate at the University of Georgia and a founding member of the percussion trio Lineage. Each of them will be offering their insight and performance to this session. So how does one develop subtlety and nuance in performance? Listening to and modeling some of the finest players in top-tier orchestras performing under highly respected conductors seems like a pretty good approach. Taking percussion performance to the same level as the finest woodwind players, brass players, or string players is what we should all strive for. I believe that there are 3 steps to this process that will help bring your own ideas inside the musical performance and enhance subtlety and nuance. The first step is deep listening to how each of these musicians approach all the musical parameters. How do they regard the tempo, the timing of the individual notes, changes in tonal quality, the endless degrees of stress and dynamic shading, the phrase structures of a particular passage? Deep listening to all types of music and musicians is instrumental, and the pun was intended. The second step is a deep analysis as to how and why you think the musicians are creating their interpretation. Do you hear slightly less weight on the third note of a figure? How did the musicians do that, and why do you think it happened? The last part involves what Arthur Lippner calls curiosity and adventure. How can each of us speak through our instruments in the same manner as those we are modeling? To me, this is the definition of technique: determining what you want to say through the music and communicating those ideas through your instrument. I've often wondered why percussionists seem to live in two different worlds. In the keyboard percussion world, playing with nuance is king. Individual musicianship is highly rewarded, and we practice our scales and arpeggios for technique, or what could be called target practice. Yet everyone agrees that when performing actual music, it's critical to bring our own ideas and expression to the performance. In the drumming world, playing with perfection seems to be king, and individual musicianship is sometimes frowned upon. We practice our stick control, cross-sticking exercises, and playing those 10 perfectly identical strokes on the triangle to gain facility. But it seems we too often stop at developing technique. Percussion performances often stress complex rhythmic ideas, amazing feats of independence, and pyrotechnic displays of speed. And sometimes simply being able to get through a piece is a major achievement. But all too often we stop there. There are some teachers and players who speak about playing the ink. Just play the ink, they'll say. But to me, this is no different than suggesting that we just read the words in a drama. Of course, music is not the ink that is written on a page. Music must be heard. To bring music to life, it must be more than the dots. And it's up to the performer to interpret the musical words written on the page. The next etude performance is the march from the Love for Three Oranges by Sergei Prokofiev. It's really a lot of fun to play, and this recording is a live performance with the San Francisco Symphony, Michael Tilson Thomas conducting. This is obviously a march, and the first two measures serve as the fanfare to the first thematic material. Bold, fortissimo, very near the exact center of the drum for a drier sound. I give slightly extra weight to the eighth notes to give them the agogic accent, notes that are longer than the notes around it. The written staccato notes help to separate the figures by adding a little more space between the eighth and the next figure. By giving those notes a little more stress, it better defines the groupings as 3 notes long. This fanfare is a single 2-bar phrase, and even though there is no written dynamic change, I'll play a crescendo leading into the 4th beat of the 2nd bar, for 2 reasons. First, to cause the contrast between the fortissimo and the mezzo piano to be a little more pronounced, and to slightly emphasize the idea of the ending of that phrase on the 8th note to signal the end of the fanfare. And along with that idea of an ending brings the anticipation of something new coming up. It's interesting to note that the entire piece has several passages that begin with a 2-note upbeat. The opening fanfare and, in measure 3, the first passage of the march theme. For that reason, I'm going to take the 2 notes that make up the anacrusis and direct them into the downbeat of the 3rd measure, sort of a falling into the next measure. This may or may not give the impression of a repeat of the fanfare's phrase, as it begins with the same rhythm. But here, at the end of the 2nd measure, the anacrusis leads to a metric downbeat rather than the weaker 2nd beat, as in the opening of the fanfare. Along with the change to mezzo piano for the first theme, I'll move my beating spot a little more off-center to create a new timbre. Here my sticking will be right, left, with just a little more weight to the 1st and 3rd beats to emphasize the march-like character. Dotted eighths and 16ths, or in this case, eighths followed by 16th rests, are always fun and challenging to interpret. In this recording, the 16ths are a little closer to the half note than the perfectly metrically precise notes might be. Why would the players do this? Well, the 16th is the same pitch as the 8th, And by making it just a little bit shorter and closer and a little bit softer, it will naturally give the dotted half note more strength. This dotted note has a much heavier stress for 3 reasons. The A-flat sounds a bit like a temporary tonic with all of the nearby E-flat pitches, the dominant to A-flat. It's the longest note in the piece up to this point, and it has the addition of the dynamic accent. Measures 5 through 8 present both a musical and a technical challenge. In listening to this recording, there are obvious differences between 2 figures, notes or rolls that are tied and rolls that are untied. Another fun aspect of this etude is catching the subtle relaxation in tempo at figure 50, the second statement of the theme, and the more drastic tempo changes at figure 53, the last statement of the theme, and figure 54, the coda. When we are drumming, we tend to teach and practice technique, and raw technique is easy. Go through this book, then that book, then the next book, add a little excerpt work here and there, learn this piece, march that show, set up the big rules and follow them, such as piano strokes should be played close to the edge and only 2 inches off the drum head. Or it's better to use a thumb roll here. It's that age-old, what stick should I use question. But there are no right answers. Playing and teaching music is much more difficult. Creating a meaningful, deliberate interpretation requires careful consideration of all the musical elements. The sound, the melody, the rhythm, both large scale and small scale, and the formal structure, even extra musical considerations. Analogies might be comparing reading to acting, or writing a story when compared to writing poetry. I've prepared a series of etudes based on rhythmic reductions of orchestral passages. These reductions include all of the original score's exact dynamics, articulations, slur markings, phrase markings, breath markings, tempo and expression markings. These are not the percussion parts. They are primary melodies, contrapuntal lines, accompanimental passages, and more. The etudes are supplied with play-along recordings of some of the top orchestras in the world, and performing the etudes along with the orchestra will develop subtlety and nuance in your playing. Each person performing these etudes will take a distinctive approach and create a unique interpretation based on how he or she wants the music to sound. And isn't that what we're trying to do as performers? I say it is. This next etude, performed on crash cymbals, presents a number of extremely fun challenges. The first movement of Gustav Mahler's Fifth Symphony begins with a solo trumpet, making a statement that announces the funeral march, marked in measured step, strict, and wie ein Conduct. Mahler's own instructions in the score can be translated as, the upbeat triplets of the theme must always be played somewhat superficially, quasi accelerando, in the manner of military fanfares. The first challenge is the speed of the four-note groupings, and it's important that each of the notes speaks clearly. My goal here is to get each of the triplet notes to be slightly stronger than the note before it, with the longer half note of the figure having additional stress. This half note is an agogic accent in combination with a metric accent, along with a dynamic accent. The rest after the half note helps to separate these figures from one another. The mood here is somber, so even with the sforzando dynamic, I'm going to save my highest dynamic points for the three whole notes before figure one. Perhaps these are three huge sobs, followed by a whimpering of the mourners. Regardless of the expression markings, the opening passage is played by solo trumpet, and there is a good deal of freedom that the performer expresses in the rhythmic timing, both in the figures themselves and in the space between them. Performing this and several other sections of the excerpt rely on what might best be called musical intuition. Unlike the tempo changes in the Prokofiev etude, tempo changes in this etude are more organic in nature. By carefully listening and trying to feel the group's energy, one can better anticipate the changes in momentum. It's extremely difficult when playing crash cymbals to adjust the timbre of the cymbals by changing their beating spots. But it is possible to make very slight adjustments to the grip, to the pressure of one cymbal against the other, how quickly the cymbals leave each other after making contact, how far apart the cymbals withdraw after the strike, muffling quickly or feather dampening, and the amount of energy at the plate's contact. For example, having one cymbal move into each other, or by having both cymbals moving at the point of impact. All of these subtle adjustments will have an effect on the performance, and therefore on the listener. The tambourine can be one of the most expressive instruments in the percussion section. The combination of controlling and influencing both the sound of the head and the sound of the jingles can produce an almost infinite variety of subtle timbres. This etude is a passage from Igor Stravinsky's famous ballet, Petrushka. In performing this etude on the tambourine, I incorporate a number of striking techniques, playing with 1, 2, 3, or even all my fingers, playing with the fingertips or the pads of the fingers, letting the fingers bounce off the head or leaving the fingers against the head after the stroke, resting the heel of my hand on the head to manipulate the head's resonance, and moving my beating spots closer to the edge or to the center of the head. To control the sound of the jingles, I adjust the angle of the tambourine to various positions, from completely vertical to completely flat, sometimes changing positions gradually and sometimes changing from one note to the next. As in the etudes performed earlier, decisions about dynamics, timing, timbre, and phrasing are made by careful listening and using the orchestra sound as the model to begin my interpretation, along with a detailed analysis of the rhythmic weight and relaxation of various notes and passages. Of course, this is not the only way to interpret the performance of this etude. Each person playing these etudes will arrive at their own individual interpretation, and all interpretations are valid. I'd now like to introduce Mike Sammons, the Director of Percussion Studies at the University of Utah. He'll be speaking toward the Bela Bartok etude, the first movement of Dance Suite.
What a wonderful resource Dr. Weinberg has created with his book, Touch. I'm honored to hopefully help illustrate a few thoughts from my favorite excerpt, Bela Bartok's Dance Suite. To develop my own touch on the snare drum, as well as my students on anything from Advanced Peters to Tompkins and Delacluse, I strive to make my practice sessions harder than the game, so to speak. I play passages restricting myself to only one beating spot, performing at one stick height and with a one dynamic mindset, all while working to realize all of the dynamics, articulations, phrase markings, and inflections. This allows me to focus on a few things. Number one, my grip. Where are my fulcrum points? Front of the T, back of the T, more middle finger, more thumb and pointer, somewhere in between? Is my grip more open or more closed? Number two, what parts of the body and stroke am I activating? Arm, wrist, fingers? How do various fulcrum points and pressure affect my natural stroke? Number three, velocity, natural weight, and rebound. Exploring these factors and how they relate to each other is key for me to learning how to affect the color of sound and length of resonance, or touch. Regarding the Bartók itself, I like to use an open 7-stroke roll for the 8th note rolls and bassoon solo in the opening section, as I think it speaks to the folk music character of the material, phrasing, and orchestration. Speaking of rolls, I use a lot of one-handed multi-bounce rolls throughout the etude to mimic the inflection of the solo bassoon and oboe's longer notes. Using a one-handed roll approach also keeps the density light as per the orchestration. For any duration longer than a quarter, or for thicker orchestrations, I use a standard orchestral or multi-bounce roll. A trick for extremely loud and sustained rolls is to experiment playing off the snare bed. I use this at measure 101 and feel like it allows the snare drum to open up and breathe a bit. Even experimenting with single forte and up dynamic notes on or off the snare bed can be the difference between subtle inflections, articulations, and color changes. Square 7 and 8 of the etude offer some potential opportunities for this. At square 4 of the Bartók, the biggest challenge is placement of the grace note. Notice I didn't say flammed roll. The oboist performs with a lot of rubato, and the grace note placements are all a little different each time it's played, which can be counterintuitive for us percussionists. Another one of these moments is in the clarinet's 16th notes in measures 74 through 76. Lots of inflection and rubato here. Having big ears is crucial in the performance of this etude as a whole. There are many solo and virtuosic moments throughout, made more difficult with no conductor. Of course, even if there were a conductor, and you can insert your own conductor joke here. Overall, I strive to listen for initiation of sound, feel for breath, and look for body language that helps me get in touch with how my fellow musicians are interpreting musical moments in ensemble settings, chamber and large. This can be even more challenging to actuate through a recording, but I think this is one of the main focal points of touch, big ears and imagination. My second favorite part of the etude is tempo 1, measures 109 to the end. My first favorite part being the opening section. In the closing section, you find indications such as tranquillo, sempre più tranquillo, più piano, ritardando, and rallentando. In reaction to these markings, as well as the overall orchestration, I decided to turn the snares off for this section and feel it captures the timbre and essence of the ending. Plus, it's fun and I think it sounds cool. I hope you find these comments helpful and I hope you enjoy the performance.
Trevor Barrero is currently a DMA candidate at the University of Georgia and a founding member of the Lineage Percussion Trio. He'll be playing the etude of Polovetzian Dances No. 17 by Alexander Borodin.
Hello everyone, I'm Trevor Barrero, and I really want to thank Dr. Weinberg for inviting me to speak and perform for you all today. I've been working through the Touch etudes for over a year now, and they continue to give me new ideas and new challenges every single time I revisit the book. Today I'll be performing the Borodin etude on snare drum, which is pulled from number 17 of the Polovetzian Dances. I found that this piece particularly challenged me in three unique ways. One, it forced me to analyze the rhythmic interpretation of the ensemble soloists on the recording. Two, it made me consider the snare drum's contribution to the color and pitch content of the music. And three, it caused me to address the musicality of my snare drum roll and the ways in which to make the actual sustain of the roll more expressive. So let's dive in with that first idea of rhythmic interpretation. When we look at the opening measures of the snare etude in Norm's book, we see a fairly basic rhythmic pattern. 3, 4, 1 and 2, 3 and a 4, 1 and a 2. Now this is exactly how I would expect this passage to be played by one of my own students if they brought this in for one of our lessons. It needs to be accurate and precise. But now we'll listen to Steinberg and the Pittsburgh Symphony perform the opening melody, and we'll see if our accurate and precise interpretation of this rhythm aligns with that of the PSO soloists. Now, as percussionists, we probably have a lot of red flags going off as we're listening to that recording and comparing it to the written score. The flautist is not playing a perfect, evenly spaced triplet. But that's obviously intentional, and we hear this all the time with phenomenal musicians. Consider a string player playing the music of J.S. Bach. They'll sit on a certain chord tone for a split second longer to give it the necessary emphasis that it needs for that passage. So understanding that, this Borodin passage actually can free us up as percussionists, allowing us to see rhythm and approach it as expressive musicians rather than precise machines. So even here at the beginning of this etude, it's such a workout for our listening skills and our memorization skills as we try to learn the unique ways that each different soloist in the ensemble approaches this opening melody. And it's our job to adapt to those different interpretations, and hopefully you'll hear me do that at the beginning of my performance. But before I get up to perform the piece, I would like to address the second point, which is the snare drum as a pitched instrument in our ensemble. I feel like lots of us, when we're mounting our drum heads onto our snare drums, we're definitely tuning it to a specific pitch. We're clearing the head to get the best possible pure pitch out of our drum. But as soon as we put that drum in the context of an ensemble, or even in a solo situation, we're not thinking of it as a pitched instrument. So I'm performing the piece on my 13-inch Black Swamp titanium snare drum, and I really tuned it pretty low for that drum just to match the general mood and color of this piece. And I also use different beating areas on the snare drum to try to counterbalance or to perfectly mimic the pitch content of the ensemble in certain moments. So for this piece, I really take advantage of that thinner, higher pitch sound that's at the edge, and I use that for my soft playing, especially when I'm doubling the upper woodwinds and the high strings. However, later on in the performance, you'll see that in order to differentiate between the oboe solo and the English horn solo, I actually rotate physically 90 degrees to play perpendicular to the snare wires. This achieves a similar thinness in sound, but it's a bit drier and a bit darker. And for my last point, I'd like to discuss the role of our rolls. Maybe I should put text. The role of our rolls. Oftentimes I've found that I fall into this trap of just picking my roll skeleton based on the tempo of the piece, and then I just coast on autopilot with that roll base for the entire piece. So as I was playing through this Borodin excerpt, I found that my rhythmic interpretation and the color and the timbre I was achieving through different beating areas was definitely complementing the orchestra in ways that I wanted, but as soon as I got to my sustain notes, it sounded noisy and distracting. And this book, more than anything else, has made me realize how wind and string players are actively participating in the duration of their notes. They're completely focused on the quality of sound throughout the sustain of that entire note, and they're changing their bow or airspeed and vibrato in order to achieve the type of sustain they want. So in this performance, I really challenged myself to be a bit more expressive with my rolls and really try to actively participate in the entirety of that sustain. So Rather than just doing my normal triple bounce orchestral roll, I tried to add a few more bounces per hand in certain moments to make the roll a bit denser. I also tried doing short burst rolls like this. And this idea of expressivity and changing our techniques and the standard way of playing doesn't have to just apply to our rolls, but it can apply to ornaments as well. So there are moments in the piece where you'll see me do a typical drag, right, right, left, or left, left, right. But lots of times I actually open it up more like timpani, so right, left, or left, left, because that's how these instrumentalists are phrasing their grace notes. So I'm so grateful for this book for opening up my ears and allowing me to find new ways to approach snare drum as an instrument and as an expressive instrument within the context of an ensemble. So I hope you enjoy this performance of the Borodin Etude from Norm Weinberg's book, Touch.
Rick Puzo is the director of percussion at Chadron State College. He's going to be speaking about his approach to the Roman Carnival Overture Etude by Hector Berlioz.
Right at the beginning, I'm imagining playing the opening passage like a wind player. I need to feel my breathing is in sync with the English horn soloist and then link that physically to what's happening as my sticks contact the head. My use of playing zones is to create a melodic shape and not necessarily for dynamic contrasts. Also, here in the beginning and elsewhere in the etude, there are connected quarter note rolls. The notation here is specific and matches what is in the orchestral score. While the roll is 2 beats in length, it is not notated with a half note as in measure 8. Out of context, one might just play a roll of 2 beats in length without any other musical device. Listening to the music while watching the etude notation, there is melodic movement on the quarter note. I wanted to express this melodic movement in my playing, and I decided to move from the edge towards the center slightly and also subtly pulse the quarter notes to help imply the melody. I am trying to employ this concept whenever I see this kind of notation. One of the most fun passages is the sequence of 3-stroke roughs beginning in measure 74. These ornaments are found in the score in the viola and cello parts. The passage is not marked with any musical direction but ends with a clear cadence that should be observed. I add a little emphasis through weight by lifting my forearm rather than using my wrist. I found this passage to require some stamina to execute the 16 roughs in quick succession cleanly. I created a short exercise to help with these rudiments. Also in this playing example, I am using different playing zones to help capture the textural changes in the orchestration. At the Allegro vivace section after rehearsal 5, the meter switches to 6/8 and has a clear 2 feel. While the passage is piano with marcato markings, I am thinking about performing this passage tightly in time and with a slight pulse to indicate the dotted quarter as the unit of the beat. As the rhythms, the melody, and the orchestration lead the passage to a conclusion, I want to make sure that I add an emphasis to indicate the cadence or arrival point. Another example where I am trying to use timbre changes to create a relative melodic contour is at the very end of the etude. Here, where the music is marked rehearsal 13, the string section has a rising sequenced passage. It is already fortissimo at this point, and it didn't seem to capture the energy of the rising sequence by just playing in the center of the drum. I play a crescendo, even though it's not marked in the score, and move towards the edge of the drum for each time through the sequence. The result, I believe, helps to more effectively create the excitement that is in the strings as the drum is sounding higher and higher as I move to the edge. And then at rehearsal 14, I play the last 2 bars, moving from the edge back to the center to create an impactful closing that has an idiomatic and drier snare drum sound as I attempt to match the marcato articulation in the orchestra.
Thank you so much for watching my clinic, and I hope it has provided you with some ideas that you can use to craft your performances to better express yourself through the music. Thank you again to my sponsors, Yamaha, Zildjian, Vic Firth, Remo, and Black Swamp. And thank you to the Percussive Arts Society. A big thank you to Mike Sammons, Trevor Barrero, and Rick Puzo.